The right to keep and bear arms, as Roger Sherman put it, is one of our most essential rights. The founders considered it part of the first law of nature, the duty of self-preservation. But it should be obvious to all of us that this hasn't stopped governments from violating it or attacking this natural right. And the founders told us over and over and over that it's up to us, the people of the states, to protect and defend our own Constitution and our own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. So on this episode, we're going to apply their principles and strategy to protect and defend the Constitution and liberty, but specifically to the Second Amendment to protect it from federal violation. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, December 13th, 2024. And I want to kick it off here with this fantastic statement from St. George Tucker, his view of the Constitution of the United States. He said, "This may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature." Now, as I mentioned right at the outset, this episode is focusing narrowly on a strategy to stop the feds from violating the Second Amendment. This is something they've been doing every single day, 24/7, 365, since 1934, and passage of the National Firearms Act of 1934, plus all the other stuff, 1968, 86, and beyond. But I do think it's also important to mention how the founders viewed, well, the right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms more generally. We already heard from St. George Tucker. Here's James Wilson, one of the top legal minds of the founding. He was one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court. And he said, "The defense of oneself, justly called the primary law of nature, is not, nor can it be, abrogated by any regulation of municipal law." But as St. George Tucker also pointed out, governments tend to have different ideas than, well, what we tell them our natural rights are. And he said, in most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. So they're happy to say, oh, we're not violating your right to keep and bear arms. We're not violating the Second Amendment. We're only kind of having reasonable regulations, things like that. These are great examples of how this plays out in practice. St. George Tucker understood this all the way back at the beginning of the 19th century when he published this in 1803. So when it comes to federal gun control, this here from James Iredell, also one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court, is how we view all of their so-called acts, laws, rules, regulations, orders, whatever, including the very existence of the ATF, which the only thing it's authorized to do under the Constitution is disband. Anyways, Iredell put it like this: any law not warranted by the Constitution is a bare-faced usurpation. And usurpation of power was considered a really, really bad thing. St. George Tucker called it treason against the sovereignty of the people. That's the final authority of the people. And if you think about it under a constitutional system where the power flows from the people are the source of the power, and government is only authorized to exercise those things that have been delegated to them, as soon as they go beyond that limit, they're stealing. They're stealing power from the people. They're committing a crime in one way or another. Certainly, I think it is a crime against humanity to restrict these inherent natural rights. But Iredell specifically said any law not warranted by the Constitution is a barefaced usurpation. That's a lot of emphasis right there. And Tucker put it like this: every extension of the administrative authority beyond its just constitutional limits is absolutely an act of usurpation. So the question then is, since we view all federal acts, laws, rules, regulations, and orders restricting, limiting, common sense regulations on the right to keep and bear arms, our natural right of self-defense, as an act of usurpation, what are we supposed to do with these usurpations of power? Well, Alexander Hamilton, of all people, was very clear on this. Here he is writing in Federalist number 33 about the Supremacy Clause, and he said, acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, will be merely acts of usurpation. And get this, they will deserve to be treated as such. Man, if we look at acts of usurpation with the disdain, the anger, and, well, whatever you want to call it, that we should be looking at them, then deserve to be treated as such, really has a lot of meaning to it. James Iredell, back to him. Here he is how he put it. He said, the only resource against usurpation, the only thing that can be done to stop it, is not something you try way later on or after everything else kind of fails, or maybe we'll consider it. The only way to deal with usurpation, he said, is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. That's the only way to respond to it, according to one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. But rather than following this specific approach, and maybe it's because people never learn about these types of things from the government-run schools, because government-run schools don't teach us how to properly limit the power of government. They teach us, well, what you got to do is you got to protest, or you got to go to the courts, or you got to, vote the bums out, and hopefully you'll convince the government to not do what the government was never supposed to do in the first place. And that's how most people treat things rather than how they're supposed to. Basically, they want you to believe that we're supposed to sit idly by and try to convince government, like I was just saying, to stop doing what it was never supposed to do. Whether it's through waiting on a new administration to do the right thing and magically end all the federal gun control, or waiting on the federal courts that have had almost a century to put a stop to this stuff and have failed to do so as well. Well, this is not the action of a free people. This is not the mentality, the approach, or strategy of a people living in the land of the free. This is a population on its knees begging for scraps, begging for permission. And Thomas Jefferson really nailed it when he said, timid men, and this is a paraphrase, timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty. And Thomas Paine really nailed it as well when he said, the strength and powers of despotism consist wholly, not partly, not kinda, not sorta, not mostly, but wholly, in the fear of resisting it. Or James Otis Jr., writing as Freeborn American back in 1767 in April, he said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. Anytime we bring up this type of a strategy, it doesn't get too far out there amongst the organizations that profess to support your natural right of self-defense, Second Amendment, whatever you want to call these organizations. They tell us this is too extreme. We've heard this type of thing behind the scenes. Oh, this is pushing it too far. We don't want to go out on a limb on these things. We're going to take it to court, whatever it may be. But in essence, we're being told submit and wait it out, and we'll try to convince the federal government to stop itself. And James Otis Jr. was pretty clear here that nothing destroys liberty more than this opinion that it is better to tamely submit, and literally asking the government to stop itself, to me, is tamely submitting. And the reason for all this is because every time you allow something to get entrenched, rather than getting rid of it, you end up within just a few short years, and sometimes even within months, instead of the so-called opponents claiming that they're going to get rid of something, they're like, well, let's just replace it with some other version of it that works better. They don't tend to give up their power. This is because the founding generation recognized very clearly the danger of precedent. Even the smallest precedent guarantees you're going to get more and more nasty stuff from government, which is, I guess, redundant, in the future. Here's how John Dickinson put it near the end of 1767. He said, when an act injurious to freedom has once been done and the people bear it, the repetition of it is more likely to meet with submission. Don't submit to stuff that they're not supposed to do, is the message from Dickinson and many others from the founding generation and the old revolutionaries. Dickinson continued, for as the mischief of the one was found to be tolerable, they will hope that of the second will prove so too. And they will not regard the infamy of the last, because they are stained with that of the first. So again, the question is, what needs to be done? And back to James Iredell, he kicks it off with this. He was talking specifically about, I ideas that maybe Congress would pass something concerning religion, even though there was no power delegated to the federal government. This is prior to debates over the Bill of Rights. And so people were saying, hey, if this is not spelled out, how can they do this? And we could apply the same thing to any other thing that has not been delegated to the federal government, including any restrictions or limitations on the right to keep and bear arms. They are not in there in the Constitution, period. But here's how Iredell put it. He said, if any future Congress should pass an act concerning the religion of the country, it would be an act which they are not authorized to pass by the Constitution, and which the people would not obey. In other words, soon as they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, you're not supposed to comply with it. Dickinson, going back to 1765 and the Stamp Act, he had this same mentality, the same approach in how to deal with the British. He had a very widely influential and widely read broadside and pamphlet urging the people to refuse to comply with the Stamp Act, because he said if you comply with the act by using stamp papers, you rivet perpetual chains around your unhappy country, and you voluntarily establish what he called the detestable precedent. So the mentality from the founding generation here, even on the Federalist side, was certainly that the people would not obey when government goes beyond the limits of the Constitution. Unfortunately, a lot of people have been obeying a lot of things for a lot of years, especially when it comes to the natural right of self-defense. The idea of getting a permission slip is not really a good one either. Here's how Theophilus Parsons put it in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said, an act of usurpation is not obligatory. It is not law, and any man may be justified in his resistance. Or back to North Carolina, John Steele, somebody I don't think I've cited before on this show, but he put it like this: if the Congress make laws inconsistent with the Constitution, independent judges will not uphold them, nor will the people obey them. A universal resistance will ensue. So universally, the people should be resisting by refusing to obey acts beyond the limits of the Constitution, according to John Steele, to people like Iredell and others during the ratification debates. And then he's saying independent judges will not uphold them. You're not going to get a case or a controversy until it impacts somebody. So it does require, even if you're thinking you're going to get a bunch of wins on the federal court level, you still certainly have to have people refusing to comply with those acts in order to create that scenario. But anyways, in Federalist number 46, James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, put this all together in what I consider a blueprint for how states, localities, and individuals should respond to usurpations of power, acts that are outside the limits of the Constitution, what Madison called unwarrantable measures, and then also federal acts that are within the bounds of the Constitution, but are just seen as bad policy, what he called warrantable measures. He advised 4 steps that needed to be taken. And if you take a bunch of these steps, or all of these steps in a bunch of different states, Madison specifically told us that this would create an environment the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. Now, I'm running this show off of a MacBook Pro, but if I'm having difficulties with getting the thing to work, I'll probably take it to an Apple store, because they're the ones that built the thing. Now, James Madison, of course, was not the only guy. He was very influential in getting the Constitution put together and passed, especially through the ratification process. They call him the father of the Constitution for a reason. I don't think it's totally accurate, but he's a pretty influential guy. And he's telling us that if the Constitution isn't being enforced, this is what's supposed to be done. He didn't mention anything about voting bums out or going to the federal courts to sue them and getting the federal courts to stop part of the federal government. That is part of the system, but ultimately it is up to the people in the states themselves to get the job done when the federal government refuses to follow the rules. And those 4 steps that Madison had are protests by the people, outspoken governors also protesting, legislative devices by the state legislatures, and then a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. This isn't some 1960s era Berkeley hippie saying refuse to comply. This is James freaking Madison, the father of the Constitution, saying the way to stop the federal government is you have to refuse to obey them. And that's how you keep them in check. And a month earlier than this, Roger Sherman, who I cited right at the beginning of the show, he came to pretty much the same kind of a strategy. He said, all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. And with this one short, simple, well, 2 sentences, I guess I can count, even though I went to government-run school, we get 4 essential points-ish. Well, I guess it depends on how I go through these. First of all, governments are going to do what governments do. Even if you give them rules, governments may still try to pass stuff that goes beyond those rules. And we see this happen all the time. Certainly, we live under the largest government in history today. It's nowhere close to what James Madison described in Federalist 45, a government of powers that are few and defined, with everything else reserved to the states or to the people. So governments will, even if you give them rules, governments just might happen to violate those rules. So we know that acts of Congress might exist even though they're not warranted by the Constitution. Now, just telling them to stop doesn't work. They still try to enforce the stuff that they're not authorized to do. Sherman obviously understood this. They may enforce them, but if you get a majority of the states to stand up, and when you're talking about states, you're talking about state governments and the people of the several states. So they still try to enforce their stuff. And in the federal system, in the system under the Constitution, as the framers and the supporters of the Constitution told us over and over and over, when a bunch of the states, we're talking about the people themselves and the state governments, refuse to go along, the federal government's laws may be on the books, but they can't be enforced in practice. And most important here, I think this is probably number 4, the 4th point out of Sherman's statement here, is that all of this, just like I was getting to a few minutes ago, it requires the people to refuse to obey the federal government because there's nothing for anyone to enforce if the people just comply across the board. There is no issue about enforcement. People are just following what they're told to do. And James Otis Jr. put it like this: so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. And to me, we really have 4 steps or 4 pillars, foundational principles that are essential to nullify and defeat all federal gun control, past, present, and future. Of course, we generally cite the National Firearms Act of 1934 as being the first, the Gun Control Act of 1968 being next. There's another one in between there, smaller ones. Its amendments in 86, of course, the bump stock ban that was finally overturned after many, many years of going through court process, but a lot of compliance, and there's certainly going to be a precedent that someone's going to use on that again in the future. Whatever that Safer Communities Act in 2023, anything else in between, again, past, present, and future, we got to get rid of all of it. And I think putting this all together, we have 4 steps or 4 principal pillars. First of all, the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right, not a gift of government. 2, no restrictions at all should exist, period. 3, states need to stop helping in the enforcement of all federal gun control immediately. In fact, we know that the ATF, again, which shouldn't exist, has somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 employees. I think the last number I saw was around 5,400. They do an annual report. We cover it every year, sometime in the summer, depending when government releases their numbers. But they have around 5,400 employees, 5,500 employees. About a third of them are in administration. That leaves the rest of it, 3,000 to 4,000. My math is terrible. Again, government-run schools did not help. Between 3,000 and 4,000 employees are in the enforcement action or the enforcement arms of the ATF. And with that capacity, they can close somewhere between 10 and 11,000 cases per year. Now, that's 10 to 11,000 too many, but almost all of those are done with support and help from state and local governments. So the states need to use those legislative devices that James Madison described in Federalist 46 And of course, not enforce, like Roger Sherman mentioned weeks earlier, to make an environment where it's more likely that the people will have the courage to refuse to comply, to refuse to cooperate with those officers of the union. And ultimately, that's number 4. The people have to refuse to obey in large numbers. They have to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government happens to like it or not. And I think Samuel Adams summed all of this up best. He said, "The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought." That's from his essay writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette. October 14th, I believe, was the date, 1771. This is the publication, really, of the Sons of Liberty at the height of the American Revolution. The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. And I'm pretty confident that the 10th Amendment Center is probably the only organization out there teaching these essential foundational principles. If there's other ones, that's awesome. We need many more on board with this, but nothing helps us reach and teach more and more people with this kind of information from the founders, the old revolutionaries, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you want to help us continue to do this work and grow and do better at it every single day and reach more people, nothing helps us get that job done. Again, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. No pressure to join, but I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to becoming a member of the TAC today. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also do a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And we'll have show notes with all the links and the original source documents that I'm citing in this episode. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I will get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done here today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. And if you really like the work that we're doing, please consider hitting that like button, subscribing, getting notifications, leaving comments, reviews on the podcast platform, all that stuff to help trigger the algorithms of these mainstream platforms. Watch the show in the background over and over. The more view time, especially on the video platforms, the more likely it'll show us to more people as well. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.